Good morning. Today I'll be talking to you about Australian literature in the 19th century and particularly about Australian poetry in the 19th century. Now, Australian literature, as I've already told you, is one of the youngest literatures in the world. Now, I've told you this in one of my earlier talks on the introduction to Australian literature. And Australian literature is only about 200 years old. Now just look at the British literature, the years of tradition, the centuries of tradition that have gone into it. Look at American literature or Irish literature for that instance. And in comparison to that, Australian literature is only 200 years old. Now you are also aware of the fact that prior to the British arrival in Australia, towards the end of the 18th century, what happened was the nomads from Indonesia had already migrated to Australia about 40,000 years ago. Now these people, they followed a very primitive style of living, and they didn't have any written language, so to speak. And when it comes to the question of white discovery of Australia, Captain Cook discovers, can we see the slides please, discovers a route from England to Australia in 1770. And it is only in 1788, on the 26th of January, that Captain Arthur Phillip lands at Port Jackson. Now we in India celebrate 26th January as Republic Day, whereas in Australia it is celebrated as Foundation Day. Now, Captain Arthur Phillip landed at Port Jackson in 1788, and you have to know the reason behind the colonization of Australia. Now, in England, what was happening at that time was the prisons were getting overcrowded. You could be jailed for a very, very petty crime like stealing a loaf of bread. So what was happening was, due to the overcrowding in the prisons, they were on the lookout for another suitable arrangement to transport the convicts to. And in the meantime, Australia was discovered. And what they found in Australia was that it was a very, very dry and arid land, and they didn't really see any economic resources there at that point of time. So what the British decided was that it was a very good place, an ideal location for their penal colony. So the convicts from the overcrowded prisons of Britain were transported to Australia. So this first fleet that landed in 1788 brought numerous convicts and their jailers to Australia. So the first white people who came to Australia were the convicts and their jailers. Now initially, in the beginning, Australia was part of the Gondwana Massland, which also included parts of Asia as well as Africa. And the aboriginal settlers, they reached the land, like I said earlier, around 40 to 50,000 years ago. Okay? Captain James Cook landed at Botany Bay in 1770, and the British monarch then was King George. And in 1780, Australia was to become a penal colony. 1788, the first fleet landed at Sydney Cove. Now, and over a period, the British colony in Australia developed over a span of 112 years. And it was in 1901 that Australia became a free nation. Now when we talk about Australian poetry, what we have to keep in mind was it began with the convict tradition. During colonial times, it was the convicts and the officers who were in charge of them who actually began writing poetry. The development of Australia and her white population, or the white people, as well as the Aborigines at different points of time, at different walks of life, was to be the theme of much of the poetry that was written in the early 19th century. Now, the earliest inhabitants, like I mentioned earlier, were the nomads who had migrated from Indonesia, and they were the Aborigines who had basically, according to the whites, no culture, no language, hence no linguistic markers or cultural markers. That was why when the whites landed in Australia, they'd called it terra nullius, which means terra as in land, nullius as in empty. So they colonized that land. Now Australia, again, let me reiterate, was colonized in 1788, and the first Australian poet laureate, so to speak, can we have the slides please, was Michael Massey Robinson. Now his dates are 1744 to 1826. Michael Massey Robinson was a convict who had landed in 1805 in Australia. He was noted for his odes published in the Sydney Gazette to celebrate the birthdays of King George III and Queen Charlotte. Now their tenure of reign was from 1810 to 1821. Now William Massey Robinson, the so-called first poet laureate of Australia, had been transported for a conviction of blackmail, and subsequently he was also convicted for forgery while a civil servant in the colony, which means in Australia. And right from 1810 onwards, he had formed the habit of publishing regularly in the Sydney Gazette odes on public anniversaries, especially the birthdays of the King and Queen. Then the next poet worth mentioning after William Massey Robinson was Francis McNamara. Now he was also a convict. Then there was Baron Field. Baron Field was born in 1786. Next slide please. He was born in 1786 and he died in 1846. Now he was a judge of the Supreme Court of New South Wales, and his first book of verse was published in 1819 and it was called First Fruits of Australian Poetry. Now Baron Field's most famous work consisted of two poems. One was called Botany Bay Flowers and the other was called The Kangaroo. Now I'll be talking to you about the kangaroo a little later. He was also to an extent the discoverer and editor of the memoirs of the first 32 years of the life of James Hardy Waugh, which he arranged to be published in London. So these three things were his main claim to fame. Then we have William Charles Wentworth, who was born in 1793 and died in 1872. He has the distinction of being the first native-born Australian poet. Now William Charles Wentworth was born on Norfolk Island, which had been settled along with Sydney Cove in 1788. He was the son of a somewhat disreputable Irish surgeon and a convict woman. Now we have to keep in mind that the first people to inhabit Australia, the first white people, were normally the convicts and their jailers. His father sent him to England for his education. And the other thing that we have to keep in mind was the fact that most of the convicts who had been transported to Australia were originally from England or Ireland. So for them, the home country or the parent country was always England. So if they had some means of livelihood, if they were somewhat comfortably off financially, what they always did was send their children back to England for higher education. So in that tradition, William Charles Wentworth was also sent to England, and he was at Cambridge. And while at Cambridge in 1823, he entered a poem called Australia for the Chancellor's Medal, and he was placed second in that. Now this poem is important because it describes the white discoveries of Australia. It talks about Aboriginal life and tribal customs. It talks about the town of Sydney and its environs and the prospects for the establishment of a new nation. So here we have a poet. And this is one of the early poets of the 19th century, the early Australian poets, who is talking about the white discovering Australia, all right? Who's talking about Aboriginal life, their traditions, their customs. And he's also talking about the idea of a new nation in Australia. Now, while Baron Field's First Fruits of Australian Poetry, published 1819, was the first book of poems from Australia to be published, it was Charles Thomson's Wild Notes from the Lyre, or for Native Minstrel, published 1823, that was the first book of poems to be published in Australia, which means that Charles Thomson's book of poems called Wild Notes from the Lyre of a Native Minstrel was the first book of poems to be published on Australian soil. And his poems are largely derived from his own experiences even if his imagery is sometimes very, very Augustan. Now we also have to remember that these people were primarily English or British people who had been transported for various reasons to Australia. So they were heavily influenced by 18th century Augustan literary traditions. Alright? Then he also writes of captivity and the bliss of freedom, of fetters, whips, and chains. Now why he's talking about the bliss of freedom, why is he talking about captivity, of whips, of chains and fetters, was because the convict system, or the whole concept behind the transportation of convicts from England to Australia, the way they were made to live in Australia, the kind of imprisonments they faced, was a very, very brutal system. So you had convicts in chains, they were fettered, they were being whipped. So all this kind of torture that was going on there within the convict system, the brutality that was being practiced there, was to touch the sensitivity of several poets. And we have Charles Thomson, who writes about this largely when he talks in his poetry. Then we have it in fiction, in short fiction, particularly in people like Marcus Clarke, and also in the Australian novel. Now, Charles Thomson also expresses a sense of loss at seeing the forests cut down and Aboriginal campsites destroyed. Now, here is another theme that is emerging. For the first time, you have somebody who's talking about the ecosystem of forests being cut down, who doesn't like that. And we also have somebody who's also taking a different side to it, who's talking about Aboriginal campsites being destroyed. On the one hand, we had Baron Field, who was talking about, and Wentworth, who were talking about Aboriginal customs and Aboriginal life, and here we have somebody talking about why Aboriginal campsites were being destroyed. Okay? And of course they were talking about the brutality of the convict system. Then the most important of the early Australian poets, however, was Charles Harper. Charles Harper was born in 1813 and he died in 1868, and he was obviously born of convict parentage. Now he is said to be the first poet who felt the moral need to write what he considered to be Australian poetry. Okay? Now he was a much better observer of nature and a better poet than the early versifiers, but he was still heavily influenced by Milton, by Wordsworth and Emerson. And Harper's sources of inspiration were chiefly literary, though his landscape and characters were Australian. Now, Australian. Then Henry Kendall is the next poet that we will talk about. Next slide, please. Henry Kendall is next in line of importance. He was born in 1839. He died in 1882. And he was the only Australian poet who was Australian-born poet of his generation. And he actually signed his poems as H. Kendall, full stop, N, full stop, A, full stop, P. Now what did this N, full stop, A, full stop, P stand for? It was Native Australian Poet. And he published 3 volumes of poetry, which was Poems and Songs, 1862, Leaves from Australian Forests, 1869, and Songs from Mountains, 1888. Now, earlier I was talking to you about Charles Harper, right? Now, Charles Harper's poem, The Bushfire, was published in the volume titled The Bushrangers and Other Songs, published 1853. Now, in this poem, Harper presents a vividly graphic portrait of the bushfire that used to rage in Australia. And this poem is a historical document of the ecosystem of Australia in the 19th century. And Harper also places human beings against the natural setting. And why does he do this? It's largely to establish the relationship between mankind on one hand and nature on the other. Then I talked about Henry Kendall. Now Henry Kendall's reputation as a poet lies in his bushland verse. Now what is bushland? We talked about the bush much earlier. Now the bush was the Australian outback, the vast Australian interiors. Alright. Now Henry Kendall's fame as a poet, his reputation as a poet, lies in the verse that he wrote about the bush. He knew and loved the temperate rainforest country on the central north coast of New South Wales, where he spent many periods of recovery from his physical and mental problems. He was a frustrated mystic, using nature as suggestive of, symbolic of, or simply as mnemonic of for the contemplation of states of mind and the nature of eternity. He used poetry to contemplate on the states of mind and to look at the nature of eternity. Then we have Adam Lindsay Gordon. He was born in 1833 and he died in 1870. Now Adam Lindsay Gordon was an expatriate poet who wrote about Australian lifestyle. He arrived in Australia in 1853 and he lived there till he committed suicide in 1870. His The Feud was published in 1864 and Astoret in 1867. Slide please. He arrived in Australia in 1853 and lived there till he committed suicide in 1877, and his Feud was published in 1864, Astoret in 1867, Sea Spray and Smoke Drift 1867, and Bush Ballads and Galloping Rhymes published in 1870. Now Adam Lindsay Gordon was the only Australian to be given a place in the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. Now this was in 1934. Gordon came to Australia in his early 20s. He worked as a mounted trooper in South Australia, then as a horsebreaker and rider in steeplechases, later becoming a land speculator. And briefly, he was also a member of the South Australian Parliament. Now, the Sydney Bulletin was launched in 1880, and this was to initiate a movement for nationalism in Australian literature. And the impact of the launch of the Sydney Bulletin in 1880 was felt mostly by people like A.B. Patterson. Now, Andrew Barton Patterson, or Banjo Patterson as he is popularly known as, was born in 1864 and he died in 1941. Andrew Barton Patterson had grown up in the grazing country of the southern slopes of New South Wales, but in comfortable circumstances amidst rich pasture lands. Now his poetry is collected in The Man from Snowy River and Other Verses, 1895, Rio Grande's Last Race and Other Verses, 1902, Saltbush Bill, J.P. and Other Verses, 1917, to name just a few of his works. Now I'll tell you a little I'll just tell you a little about Patterson before I talk about The Man from Snowy River. Patterson is a master of the easygoing ballad of action. His best-known song, Waltzing Matilda, is the tale of a swagman pursued by policemen and a squatter for the theft of a sheep, and escaping from them, and how he escapes from them only by drowning himself in the waterhole or billabong. He preserves the anti-establishment tone of the tradition of songs and ballads derived from the English, the Scottish, the American, and most commonly the Irish ballad tradition. Now, The Man from Snowy River, his most famous poem, tells the story of a horseman who belongs to the Snowy River region. The story of his bravery is recounted in the poem, and the life lived by the Australians in the pioneering days is portrayed in the poem with great authenticity. The life of the early Australians, their daredevilry, the extraordinary feats of courage, and their readiness to face the challenges of life are all portrayed vividly in the ballad. The ballad recaptures the indomitable spirit of the early Australians fighting for survival on a heroic scale. Because for them, you have to remember, especially for the early settlers, the land was alien. The flora and fauna was alien. Everything for them was alien. So they had a very difficult time adjusting to the country. Now, one striking thematic feature of the poem is the poet's descriptions of nature. In this poem, the reason why I'm talking a little at length about this poem is because this is in your course. Now, in this poem, the poet gives a memorable portrayal of the rugged mountainous region. The poet keeps the image of the mountains in the background, never really concentrating his descriptive focus on any particular aspect, till he reaches the last stanza of the poem. And in the last stanza, after the story of the man from Snowy River is told, the poet paints graphically a cool, placid mountainside. Patterson is the supreme balladist of the horse, and in Bushman fashion he viewed the horse as an animal trained for and useful for a specific purpose and specific tasks, and he admired it for its excellence in these tasks, and one of which was racing. Now, the 19th century also saw several feminist voices, such as that of Ada Cambridge. Ada Cambridge was born in 1844 and she died in 1926. Let me just try to find the slide. Okay. Ada Cambridge was born and raised in Norfolk, England, so she came to Australia much later. She came to Victoria in Australia after her marriage in 1870. Her first book of poems was published in 1875 and is entitled, can we see the slides please? The Manor House and Other Poems. Slides please. The next was Unspoken Thoughts, published in 1887. Now, Cambridge did not really receive much recognition during her time. Her feminist protest against patriarchal domination has been recognized only towards the end of the 20th century. Her Unspoken Thoughts contain poems in which Cambridge expresses her radical anti-establishment ideas, which could not be expressed in public life in those days. The poems contained in this volume express indignation at social and sexual injustice, longings for love and sexual expression, explorations of motherhood, of fear, of death and the agony of illness, and a challenging of convention and orthodox belief. So that was why her poetry was not well received during her time. Cambridge protested against moral impositions from above and questioned all hypocrisies that were practiced through the institution of marriage. Her concern for the poor and outcast finds expression in many of her poems. She adds a new dimension to 19th century Australian poetry by dwelling on issues and concerns involving the poor and the women who suffered ignominy in the Australian society of that time, much like in our society as well. Now take for instance her poem An Answer, and I quote, "Thy love I am, thy wife I cannot be, to wear the yoke of servitude, to take strange unknown fetters that I cannot break, on soul and flesh that should be mine and free. Better the woman's old disgrace for me than this old sin, this deep and dire mistake. Better for truth and honor and thy sake, for the pure faith I give and take from thee. I know thy love and love thee all I can. I fain would love thee only till I die, but I may some day love a better man, and thou mayest find a better mate than I. Some want, some chill, may steal betwixt heart and heart, and then we must be free to kiss and part." Now this is the kind of poem that a woman in the early 19th century in Australia was writing, and this was bound to not go down well with the with patriarchal systems, with male-dominated societies. Now the extreme position of a woman advocated by the poem was shocking not only for the men but also for the female activists of the day, as the poem espouses the freedom of woman or a woman in a male-dominated society, wherein a wife was often treated as a legitimized prostitute. So within that kind of a setup, social setup, here you have a woman who's talking about woman's freedom, talking about her freedom of expression, talking about her needs, her passion, her desires. The poem expresses a spirit that is rebellious and desires to uphold her freedom of choice. It's a very, very forceful poem that is direct as well as very intense. And the poem, An Answer, has the formal structure of a sonnet. It is 14 lines, but the way in which the woman speaks add a dimension of flexibility and dynamism to this formal 14-line structure. Cambridge not only allows the woman to talk out her heart, but also gives her the words to assert and affirm her point of view. For instance, in the couplet that champions and proclaims women's independence, you have when she says, "Some want, some chill, may steal betwixt heart and heart, and then we must be free to kiss and part." Now this kind of a thought, as I said earlier, was very shocking for a woman of 19th century Australia to be talking about. Now, I mentioned earlier that Australian poets of the 19th century were also greatly influenced by the British tradition and poets. But the redeeming factor was that the Australian poets, what they attempted to do was assimilate into the English language the names of Australian flora and fauna, which means the names of Australian plants and animals. And I told you earlier that I would be talking about Adam Lindsay Gordon's poem, poems. Now, in Adam Lindsay Gordon's dedication poem in Bush Ballads and Galloping Rhymes, okay, the way he describes the eucalyptus tree, that has to be noted. And I quote, "When the gnarled, knotted trunks eucalyptine seemed carved like weird columns Egyptian, with curious device, quaint inscription, and hieroglyphic strange." Just look at the way he's trying to incorporate Australian flora into, along with the English language, to create some sense of an Australian poem or Australian poetry. Then again, in his famous ballad, The Sick Stock Rider, he writes, this is Adam Lindsay Gordon, "Let me slumber in the hollow where the wattle blossoms wave, with never stone or rail to fence my bed. Should the sturdy station children pull the bush flowers on my grave, I may chance to hear them romping overhead." Now here he is including the Australian environment, not only the Australian flora. He says, "Let me slumber in the hollow where the wattle blossoms wave." Wattle is a plant that grows particularly in the southern hemisphere and in Australia. "Where never stone or rail to fence my bed, should the sturdy station children." In Australia, you had large farms which were also into keeping livestock, and these were also always known as station. That's how you get the phrase station hand, or these men who worked on these stations. So he's talking about the station children. Now, as I told you, A.B. Patterson, or Banjo Patterson as he was more popularly known as, he immortalized the horseman, particularly in the poem The Man from Snowy River, and I talked about that poem earlier. So what was happening gradually in 19th century Australian poetry was phase by phase, and through the gradual incorporation of Australian words, Australian flora, fauna, of the Australian ethos and milieu, what was happening was they were moving towards a stage where they could talk about authentic Australian poetry, or a sense of Australian nationalism. Now, Australian poetry, like all other poetry, focuses on certain themes. And the main themes are of the land and the people. Now, the pioneering Australian poets were tantalized by the land and the people of Australia. The landscape they encountered was strange and uncouth to them, but gradually they came to accept the landscape. And they made the landscape a recurring theme of their poetry. Now, Barrenfield was the first poet to encounter the strangers of the land, and the most articulate and straightforward in his perception, as revealed in the following lines, and I quote from his poem, The Kangaroo. "Kangaroo, kangaroo, thou spirit of Australia, that redeems from utter failure, and warrants the creation of this fifth part of the earth, which would seem an afterbirth, not conceived in the beginning, for God blessed this work at first, and saw that it was good, but emerged at the first sinning, when the ground was therefore cursed, and hence this barren wood." And with the passage of time, a different mode of perception was to develop, and instead of disgust at the Australian landscape, which some of the poets, some of the early short fiction writers expressed and felt very strongly about, a sense of wonder at the manifold grandeur of Australia's natural setting, of Australia as a country, began to emerge in the poets of the land, in the poetry of the poets who were born in the land itself. Charles Harper, he celebrates Australian landscape in all its minutiae. He, however, finds in all the particularities of the Australian scene a universal pattern and design. For instance, in the concluding lines of the poem, Dawn and Sunrise in the Snowy Mountains, he says, and I quote, "As if the spirit of light, advancing swiftly thence and eastward still, kept kindling them in quick succession till the universal company of cones and pyramidal peaks, standing burning all with rosy fires, like a wide-ranging cirque of God-great altars, and even so announce the sun that now, with the vast flash, is seen, pushing his rim above your central height." Henry Kendall's poetry too reflects the sights and sounds of the authentic Australian landscape that becomes a source of not only joy but also a source of solace. And in his poem Bellbirds, this perception is of identification with Australian flora, of identification with Australian fauna, is brought out very clearly. He says, "Often I sit, looking back to a childhood, mixed with the sights and sounds of the wildhood, longing for power and the sweetness to fashion lyrics with beats like the heartbeats of passion, songs interwoven of lights and of laughters, borrowed from bellbirds in far forest rafters, so I might keep in the city and alleys the beauty and strength of the deep mountain valleys, charming to slumber the pain of my losses, with glimpses of creeks and a vision of mosses." Now the horsemen, the bushrangers and bushmen permeate Australian poetry of the 19th century. So the land and the people of Australia are observed in the entire corpus of 19th century Australian poetry, which presents a poetic chronicle of the history of the land and her people. Now, along with the theme of the assimilation of the landscape in Australian literature, and particularly in Australian poetry, is also to be found another theme. Now that was the theme of estrangement as well and alienation. Now what we have to keep in our minds constantly is the fact that most of the people who were transported, who were forcibly transported to Australia, were convicts, and they were of British or Irish origin. So for them to be uprooted from a society where they had lived their lives, where they had lived to youth, and to be brought to a new country which was so far away, which was in the opposite side of the hemisphere, which had summer when the northern hemisphere had winter, which had strange animals like the platypus and the kangaroo, which had strange trees which shed their leaves, which shed their barks instead of their leaves like the eucalyptus. For them, the land of Australia was something that was very strange and very, very alien. And the fact that they had been uprooted from one culture, from one country, and transported to another culture, to another country, created a strong sense of estrangement. So you find this theme of estrangement and alienation going hand in hand in much of the early 19th century poetry of Australia. Then the phenomena of encounter with the bizarre landscape of Australia and the reminiscence of the British homeland bred in the first poets a deep sense of estrangement and alienation, which the later poets, however, were gradually to overcome. Now for the first settlers of Australia, who were mainly convicts, the land also represented punishment. And Australia came to symbolize both torture and penalty for them. So for them, the mental associations they had with the country that was Australia were extremely glooming and forbidding. Francis McNamara, in A Convict's Lament on the Death of Captain Logan, he embodies a deep sense of estrangement and alienation when he says, I am a native of Erin's island, but banished now from my native shore. They tore me from my aged parents, and from the maiden I adore. In transient storms as I set sailing, like mariner bold my course did steer. Sydney Harbour was my destination, that cursed place at length drew near. He said, I've been a prisoner at Port Macquarie, at Norfolk Island and Emu Plains, at Castle Hill and cursed Tongaby. At all those places I've worked in chains, but of all the places of condemnation, in each penal station of New South Wales, to Moreton Bay I found no equal, for excessive tyranny each day prevails. Now here you have not only a sense of estrangement and alienation, but also a comment on the convict system and the brutality of the convict system. Now once the convict penal colony was established, what happened was more and more shipments of British convicts were to arrive on the island. And as a result of this, Australia was to witness the emergence of a phenomenon of bushmen and bushrangers. Now who were these bushmen and bushrangers? They were mostly escaped convicts ranging in the bush. So they ran away from the jails or wherever they were imprisoned, from wherever they were in fetters or in chains, and they began living in the bush. So after traveling through the dry landscape during the hot, dusty day, these bushrangers would settle down for the evening and meet fellow travelers. And they would camp in the bush, and gradually over a period of time, when they are meeting fellow travelers, they would start talking, and they would develop a sense of companionship or mateship amongst themselves. Now this idea of shared companionship or mateship was to eventually become a cult phenomenon in the 19th century in Australia, so much so that it acquired the mark of Australian identity. When we talk about what is Australian, the first thing that comes to mind even today is the concept of mateship. Okay? The ballads, rather the bush ballads, celebrated this idea of mateship among bushrangers and horsemen. And this concept of mateship was celebrated by poets such as William Charles Wentworth, say for instance in his poem The Wild Colonial Boy, where he talks of the heroism of the wild colonial boy. He talks of bushrangers roaming and galloping through the wide valley in order to remain free and far away from iron chains. And this ballad, with its cluster of simple words, rhythms and images, represents the spirit of freedom in Australia and the sense of heroic independence of the outlawed bushrangers who stood for bravery. Now these people are actually outlaws. They are actually what you'd call jailbirds who've flown the coop, so to speak. So in the eyes of law, they are what you call outlaws. But they came to, because they defied authority, because they defied establishment, and they managed to run away and they managed to survive in the bush, they came to symbolize and they came to stand for bravery and for the sense of independence on which the foundation of future Australia was actually laid. Now this ballad has been summarized in the Oxford Companion to Australian Literature as, and listen to this, I quote from it, as one of Australia's best known folk songs, telling the story of an Irish-born bushranger named Jack Doolan who terrorizes the squatters, holds up the Beechworth mail coach in the 1860s and robs Judge McAvoy, and is eventually killed when surrounded by 3 troopers, Kelly, Davis and Fitzroy, to whom he refuses to surrender. Now let me just quote this poem for you because it's part of your course material. The Wild Colonial Boy by William Charles Wentworth. 'Tis of a wild colonial boy, Jack Doolan was his name. Of poor but honest parents, he was born in Castlemaine. He was his father's only hope, his mother's only joy, and dearly did his parents love this wild colonial boy. Now in these 4 lines what the poet is trying to do is create a picture of a normal boy who is loved and cherished by his parents, Come all ye my hearties, we'll roam the mountains high, together we will plunder, together we will die. We'll wander over valleys and gallop over plains, and we'll scorn to live in slavery, bound down with iron chains. He was scarcely 16 years of age when he left his father's home, and through Australia's sunny clime a bushranger did roam. He robbed those wealthy squatters, their stock he did destroy, and a terror to Australia was the Wild Colonial Boy. In 61 this daring youth commenced his wild career. With a heart that knew no danger, no foeman did he fear. He stuck up the Beechworth mail coach, robbed Judge McAvoy, who trembled and gave up his gold to the Wild Colonial Boy. He bade the judge good morning and told him to beware, that he'd never rob a hearty chap that acted on the square, and never to rob a mother of a son and only joy, or else you may turn outlaw like the Wild Colonial Boy. One day as he was riding the mountainside along, listening to the little birds, their pleasant laughing song, 3 mounted troopers rode along, Kelly, Davis, and Fitzroy. They thought that they would capture him, the Wild Colonial Boy. Surrender now, Jack Doolan, you see there's 3 to 1. Surrender now, Jack Doolan, you daring highwayman. He drew a pistol from his belt and shook the little toy. I'll fight but not surrender, said the Wild Colonial Boy. He fired at Trooper Kelly and brought him to the ground, and in return from Davis received a mortal wound. All shattered through the jaws he lay, still firing at Fitzroy, and that's the way they captured him, the Wild Colonial Boy. Now, 19th century Australian poetry was not just about masculine heroism of voices, as we saw earlier when I talked about Ada Cambridge. You also had poets like Louisa Lawson, born 1848, died 1920. Now, she is another poet that articulates the suffering of women. In a poem titled Lines Written During a Night Spent in a Bush Inn, she talks about women's sufferings as well as of the attachment women have to the countryside of Australia. And she says, and someone among them with grief in his breast might register roughly the place of my rest, by carving in letters cut deep on its bowl these plain words, a woman, may God rest her soul. In ground that is hallowed let happy folk lie, but give me a grave in the bush when I die. For have I not lived, loved, and suffered alone, thus making it meet that my grave be unknown? The sound of the stockwhip away on the hill. Ah, God, it is day, and I'm suffering still. So here you have a woman who's actually saying, she identifies with the bush, and she's actually saying that when she dies, she wants to be buried in the bush, so that she can hear the cracking of the stockwhips away on the hills. Right? Now, summing up, I'd like to point out that though Australian poetry had its genesis in British poetry of the 18th century, but at the same time, the simplicity of the British ballads was to find its way into the evolution of Australian poetic diction of the 19th century. And as we progress in time, we realize that there are traces of the Romantic as well as Victorian elements also discernible in Australian poetic tradition. But it was the infusion of the images and the metaphors culled from Australian flora and fauna, local place names, and the gradual evolution of the ethos of the Australian milieu that was to transform the poetic style of Australia during the 19th century.